During the most recent weekly sip, I read this astonishing article. Non-binary Romeo and Juliet set in Nazi Germany apologizes for omitting Jews from the casting call. A production of Romeo and Juliet for non-binary performers, with Juliet reimagined as a persecuted Jew and Romeo as a member of the Hitler Youth, has become embroiled over its failure to include Jewish people in a casting call. The company advertised for non-binary artists and/or those of global majority, Black or Asian heritage to join the cast. The call did not include any request for Jewish performers to join the cast of the production, set in the Third Reich, and the company has publicly apologized for the omission. Please accept our profound apologies for neglecting to mention the performers of Jewish background are preferred for the Capulets. This was the initial intention. The director is Jewish, and our intention has always been to include this casting preference. My God, doesn't that sound like an amazing show? I'd love to go see that nonsense. Romeo as a non-binary member of the Hitler Youth. Juliet's probably a Black Jewish lesbian in a wheelchair, white-facing as Anne Frank. Incredible. But my curiosity was drawn to one specific passage. One word, actually. The company advertised for non-binary artists and/or those of global majority, Black or Asian heritage. Global majority? This is the first time I'd ever heard the term, but it's pretty obvious what it means, right? In white majority countries, Black people or Asian people are a racial minority, and we use that term minority to refer to them. But on a global scale, there's clearly more Black and Asian people than there are white people, making them the global majority. It's a pretty intuitive term, but where did it come from? And why is there a switch from language about minorities to the majority? When people think about minorities, they often think in broad terms left-wing politics. Your average progressive draws moral legitimacy by appealing to the rights of or the protection of various minority groups. Racial or ethnic minorities, sexual or gender minorities, religious minorities, people with various disabilities, even if they're wildly different, are often called upon as if they're a minority. The idea is that the majority culture is always going to be inherently oppressive towards these minorities. An obvious example is, in a majority Christian society, the state, the social institutions, and the general culture is going to broadly be pro-Christian, and may actively discriminate against or suppress non-Christians, maybe with state force, maybe with differing rules for interacting with social institutions, maybe with cultural exclusion. But even if that society did not actually do any of those things, there's always going to be a base level of background radiation style discrimination. The best example I can think of right now is from another Weekly Sip article, where that Muslim mother decried society being so Christmas-oriented during December, and how hard it was to shield her children from the influence of the overarching culture she was living in the West. From her point of view, even though nobody's actually oppressing her, nobody's excluding her from Christmas, and nobody's preventing her from opting out of Christmas and celebrating her own holidays, the fact that she lives in a culture where Christmas is celebrated means she feels othered every time she steps outside. In effect, from her point of view, the normal polite goings-on of a culture she lives in, but is not part of, feels exclusionary to her. And a Christian who happened to be in the Middle East during Ramadan or something would likely feel the same way. Even if he was left alone to not participate, there would still be that feeling of being a stranger in a strange land. The implication here is that a progressive society should understand that any majority is always going to be inherently oppressive towards minorities, no matter what people do, and therefore, in order to be good and moral, we should give their needs extra consideration. This is the foundation for programs like affirmative action in schools or in hiring practices, or public representation in entertainment, or providing them a special seat in government or corporate functions to ensure that their unique viewpoint has a chance to be heard and considered by the majority. Regardless of whether any of this is good or bad, factual or fake, it doesn't matter. This is what we think of when we think of the word minority in the Western world. And so the question is, why is the left slowly giving up that entire school of thought, this entire foundation of moral legitimacy, by switching rhetoric over from minorities to the global majority? Well, let's consider a few ideas. Firstly, it seems to be the case that progressives only stand up for certain types of minorities. And no, I'm not talking about them suddenly being racist towards black conservatives or shitting on right-leaning trans people, though that obviously does happen. The progs love to revoke the minority card of any individual person who is actually a minority but doesn't align with their politics. And while that's pretty funny and leads to some pretty cringe moments, that's not what I'm referring to here. Ayn Rand, being a darling of the libertarians, though she disliked the libertarian movement herself, is hated by progressives, to the point that she doesn't count as reading a female author in their view. Another funny example of revoking the minority card. But like every other great writer of history, she has at least one rock-solid, irrefutable point, and it's encapsulated in this quote: "The smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be the defenders of minorities." This seems to be the truth, as well as a shortcut to the natural endpoint of intersectional theory. The intersectionalists say that while you may be oppressed for being black and you may be oppressed for being gay in a different way, if you're black and gay, the two separate forms of oppression bolster each other, with each way you are oppressed or privileged forming the bars and the gaps of a cage which imprisons you. The natural end result of this idea is that every single individual is oppressed in a slightly different way, due to everybody having slightly different life experiences, and that each person's oppression is ultimately unique. Rand cuts through all of the necessary intersectional calculations of how you're a minority in one way and a majority in the other to arrive at the inevitable endpoint, that the individual is the smallest minority, a minority of one person weighted against the majority that is the rest of the human race. And yet, leftists don't value individuals. They reject individualism as a bourgeois capitalist mechanism that keeps communities and classes down. Class consciousness for the socialist is the rejection of that individualistic idea and instead engaging in solidarity with your social class. Race consciousness for, say, the black activist in America works the same way, to the point that individualism is now often branded as a component of white supremacy. Meanwhile, progressives aren't fond of individualism either, with a heavy emphasis on social responsibility and the welfare state overpowering any individualist concerns. The individual isn't the only minority that leftists don't advocate for. There's a joke floating around that the rich are a minority that never sees any advocacy done for them by social justice groups. And hey, you can't deny that. They're literally called the 1%. That's clearly a minority. The obvious reply to this position is that even though the 1% are a minority, they don't need activism due to their sheer material wealth. And this applies to politicians, to presidents, to kings and nobility too. These are all minorities in society, but they wield wealth and power and sometimes both, so they don't need advocates. The inverse logic also applies. Consider women. When I was back in university taking that Intro to Gender Studies class, woman was considered a minority. The professor explained even though women aren't actually a minority, there are in fact more women than men on the planet. Women have minority status in the progressive hierarchy because they're oppressed. Again, it's marginalization that grants moral legitimacy, not actually being a member of a class with fewer numbers. Back in the late 2000s, a majority population could be a minority if they were oppressed. So what's actually happening here is that when a progressive calls upon the moral legitimacy of the minority, it's not actually being a member of a minority class that generates that moral legitimacy. It's being an outsider. In a majority white society, both a white king and a black peasant are, in their own way, a minority, but the king is at the center of the society while the black peasant is on the margins. Hence the phrase marginalization. What matters in the prog estimation isn't that you're a minority, but it's that you're marginalized. This is how they can justify excluding Asians from affirmative action schemes, because they might be a minority, but they're not marginalized in their view. Majority populations, having most of the wealth and power in a given society, don't need to be protected in the same way that minority ones do. Until, of course, the progs suddenly do want to claim that status rhetorically through the use of the phrase global majority. And so far I've been describing what's been going on here, but we still haven't gotten to why the slow switch between protect minorities to protect the global majority is taking place. Let's talk about the source of political authority. All post-Enlightenment philosophies, liberalism, socialism, and fascism, claim to draw their political authority from the bottom up. Liberals talk about representative democracy, the voter, the citizen, and it's through the polity that legitimate political power springs. Socialists talk about production, the worker, the proletariat. To them, those who do all the productive labor of society are the source of legitimate political power. Fascists talk about ethnicity, the blood, the people. To them, legitimate political power comes from biological and cultural solidarity. All three of these philosophies are, in some way, majoritarian. They appeal to the vast majority of people under their rule for their legitimacy, and they claim to be implementing the will of that majority. But pre-Enlightenment philosophies, like monarchy for example, they're minoritarian. They don't care about gaining legitimacy from the citizen, or the worker, or the people. They don't answer to the majority. The divine right of kings was not simply a top-down imposition of political power, though it was certainly that, but it was also an admission that the monarch's place in the hierarchy was below God, that even as they drew their political legitimacy from God, they also had to submit to him. In secular terms, the minoritarian view is that a good leader does not simply bend to the whims of the majority of those he rules over, because those whims might be retarded. Instead, his job is to implement a political ideal as imperfectly as he can because he's still only just a human, and not be swayed by the short-sighted, selfish politics of the day. The reason that modern liberal democracy is unique is because it attempts to blend both types of legitimacy. Constitutional monarchies like the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan feature both bottom-up and top-down characteristics, with representative democracy speaking for the commoners, and a monarch that represents an ideal that those societies should be united in striving towards, despite their political differences. Meanwhile, constitutional republics like America or India have in the position of the ideal not a monarch but a constitution. It nonetheless takes on a similar function, to outline a political ideal that, regardless of the whims of the day, cannot be violated so easily. And yes, because I'm a liberal centrist cuck, I think striking this balance is the best way to do it. A society which derives political legitimacy in a purely top-down manner is primed for terrible abuses of power. where the motivations and goals of rulers fail to take into account the ruled, or worse yet, actively move against the ruled's interests. What rightoids, especially monarchist rightoids in Europe, often fail to grasp is that even for an enlightened, benevolent philosopher king, there needs to be a plebeian check on his power, because there's no reason to assume his children will be just as good as him. Meanwhile, a society which derives political legitimacy in a purely bottom-up manner immediately falls to the tyranny of the majority, where those who are different are punished for it simply because they are different. What leftoids, especially anarchists and direct democracy socialists, often fail to grasp is that 10 men gang raping a woman or 10 whites lynching a black man is a democratic act, and that minorities and individuals do need to be protected from the power of majority rule. That is why a liberal capitalist democratic system values the vote but does not hold it as the ultimate value. It's why the people still ultimately decide, but there are limits on that power. During the Russian Revolutionary period, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was split into two factions. Firstly, the Mensheviks, a Russian word meaning one of the minority, headed by Julius Martov. And secondly, the Bolsheviks, a Russian word meaning one of the majority, headed by Vladimir Lenin. The names of these groups didn't accurately describe their popularity. The 5-party congresses before the party was dissolved in 1918 showed the Bolsheviks winning 2 majorities, the Mensheviks winning 2, and one with no clear winner due to multiple other factions. But nonetheless, their names did describe how they each viewed political power. Martov, as the head of the Mensheviks, was described in the book A People's Tragedy as being too good an intellectual to be a successful politician, that he was held back from making extremist moves due to his integrity, and he chose his allies by the coherence of their worldview rather than the practical situation on the ground. He was applauded for his high-minded approach, but he was also considered indecisive during times of crisis, earning the Mensheviks the nickname of the Softs. Lenin, as head of the Bolsheviks, was described in the book The Life of Lenin as having an iron will, self-enslaving self-discipline, scorn for his opponents and for obstacles, the cold determination of a zealot, the drive of a fanatic, and the ability to convince or browbeat weaker persons by his singleness of purpose, imposing intensity, impersonal approach, personal sacrifice, political astuteness, and the complete conviction of the possession of the absolute truth. In his morality, he was a ruthless utilitarian, saying simply, does a certain action advance or hinder the cause of the revolution? Lenin and Martov were close friends. Even after the Bolsheviks took total control of Russia, outlawed the Mensheviks, and Martov was exiled to Europe, Lenin still thought of him as a friend. And on his deathbed, Lenin lamented that Martov, somewhere else in the world, was also reported to be on his own deathbed. 2 very different men, both with their own strengths and weaknesses. Martov's intelligence and morals were admirable qualities, but his lack of political experience left him open to Lenin's ruthlessness and amorality. And just in case that story makes you think, look, the guy who stuck to his principles got backstabbed and the guy who did not won. Clearly abandoning your morality in the pursuit of power is good. Look at what Lenin's ruthlessness and amorality did to Russia afterward. This is just my personal opinion here. I believe that the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were not named after literally being the majority or the minority of the socialist movement in Russia, but instead because the rank and file of those two movements did actually come to reflect the behaviors of their two leaders. The majority is an oppressive force. The left is correct when they point this out. Therefore, it's no surprise that when leftists are in the minority, they appeal to liberal principles. The idea that the center of society should not simply do what it will to those in the margins, but actually treat them with some decency. But when they become the majority, they don't appeal to that liberal principle anymore, and they take on the full moral weight of that oppressive majority to crush their opponents, in the name of doing what the majority wants. And because liberal institutions have limits on democratic power, leftists always try to dismantle those limits in the name of liberating the majority. You know that Frank Herbert quote? When I am weaker than you, I ask you for freedom because that is according to your principles. But when I'm stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that's according to my principles. That's particularly relevant here. The enemies of liberalism view liberal values like free speech, free association, capitalism and property, equality before the law, not as principles to be upheld for all, but to be used and abused while they're on the margins and to be dismantled once they take power. When a leftist appeals to the minority, it's a signal that they view themselves on the margins. They're weak and downtrodden and deserve our special consideration, beyond liberal freedoms and equality before the law. But when a leftist begins to say, we're the majority instead, like the slow shift to global minority, or, like the use of the term Bolshevik, it's a signal that they view themselves as taking power, that now their moral legitimacy comes from representing most people, not from being an outsider, and that therefore they should be listened to over any sort of pesky minority, like anybody who happens to disagree with them. And to me, that's a pretty scary shift. If you think I'm speaking out of my ass, you should read this paper written by the person who coined the term global majority in the first place, on how she intended for it to be used, a UK intellectual by the name of Rosemary Campbell Stevens. Global majority is a collective term that first and foremost speaks to and encourages those so-called to think of themselves as belonging to the global majority. It refers to people who are Black, Asian, brown, dual heritage, indigenous to the global south, and or have been racialized as ethnic minorities. Globally, these groups currently represent approximately 80% of the world's population, making them the global majority. Understanding that singular truth may shift the dial. It certainly should permanently disrupt and relocate the conversation. Applying the term global majority to groups that are routinely either not seen or marginalized not only bring in people from the margins, but brings into focus what may create marginalization, including the historical and current role of systemic racism, white privilege, and the power dynamics therein. The white elite act globally. Their power has historically resided in large part in the fact that 1% of the world's population holds approximately 44% of the world's wealth. They are globally connected, operate collectively in their mutually exclusive interest, wielding power accordingly through transnational corporations, organizations, financial institutions, governments, and multinationals. Connected systems, economic, business, political, educational, health, all work with synchronized mindsets, focused on maintaining the status quo, while simultaneously sowing and fueling discord elsewhere. The elite minority are aided and abetted across the globe by those who are not white, but who want desperately to appropriate whiteness. The so-called Third World, the occupied territory created for the global majority, is needed to maintain the concentration, flow, and control of resources, wealth, and power into the hands of the few in the First World. Poor whites are the basic members of the white club, with minimal benefits. They are there to make up numbers when required, be the deflectors or cannon fodder, and essentially act as the buffer between the white elite and those they have othered. The non-white allies are as intentional about joining the club as the elites are about maintaining the status quo and keeping them firmly at arm's length. Of course, you could never speak like this about any other race, whether true or false. Kanye's learning that the hard way right now. And it doesn't even matter that a lot of the stuff in here is false. Like the idea that the world's elite doesn't contain a lot of non-white people. Like non-white mega-rich people or the ruling elite of non-white countries don't exist or something. Because the underlying logic is clear. The progressive movement is winning. Things are changing. It's now time to stop deriving moral legitimacy from being a minority, an other, a victim, those in the margins. Now is the time to seize the moral legitimacy of the center, to take the reins of power and oppress the way that we imagine our ancestors were oppressed, to reject liberal colorblindness and right a generational wrong. It is terrifying that this is how the people who actually follow critical race theory think. Yes, some of what Europeans did to non-Europeans during the age of colonization was brutal, obviously, but we don't live in that age anymore. We've learned from those mistakes. And yet, some people still want revenge for a crime nobody alive in the West committed, and none of them ever actually experienced. All you have to do is hop on Twitter and see an infinite number of progs say that this is revenge for colonization, to understand that they've abandoned the liberal principles we were meant to live by, preferring a fucking race war instead. Anybody who thinks like this is, in my opinion, morally reprehensible. And as the phrase global majority becomes more popular over the next decade, expect a lot of people to go way more mask off.